Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Courtney Doggart, and I'm the president of Network 2020. Welcome to part 2 of Network 2020's mini-series on the migration crisis within the United States. So for those of you who are joining for the first time, Network 2020 is a New York City-based nonprofit that bridges the gap between the private sector and the international affairs worlds through in-person and virtual programs with leading experts on topics of international affairs. So please subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on social media to stay in the loop on upcoming programs. In the first part of our mini-series on migration, we looked at the root causes of migration from the Northern Triangle. Today, we will look at the crisis through the lens of New York City and how it is dealing with the 170,000 people who have arrived over the past 2 years. And we'll try to situate this current situation in historic context, as well as within the maze of federal, state, and local politics. This story, this situation that we are exploring today, it's not just a domestic or local one, though it might seem so on the surface. Those who follow U.S. domestic politics are well aware that what happens at the U.S. southern border is now being tied to aid in Ukraine. So there are immediate foreign policy ramifications. And on a more macro level, a number of global trends are influencing migration patterns. The after effects of COVID-19 in lesser developed countries that did not have the income support structures that wealthier countries had means that 50 million more people were pushed into income poverty in 2020. Rising prices brought about by the war in Ukraine. Climate change causing higher impact weather events. And in this century, 98% of demographic growth will take place in lesser developed countries, while the remaining nations face aging, shrinking populations. So it is imperative that we not only understand and address the underlying causes of immigration when appropriate, but that we as societies realize that tackling the migration crisis in a humane and fiscally prudent way requires developing smart policies that are responsive to those big picture trends so that we can strengthen rather than divide societies. And so with that, I am so pleased that we have 3 terrific guests today who can really help us look at what smart policies might be for New York and the United States. First, we have Camille Joseph Varlack, Chief of Staff to New York City Mayor Eric Adams. She is a founding partner and former chief operating officer of Bradford, Edwards, and Varlack, where she led the firm's business advisory, employment, risk, and crisis management practices. She is a former assistant district attorney in Kings County and served in the New York State Executive Chamber as deputy director of state operations, chief risk officer, and special counsel, where she managed the operations, general policy development, and implementation of major policy initiatives for over 60 New York State agencies and authorities. Welcome, Camille. I am also pleased to welcome Nancy Foner, Distinguished Professor of Sociology at Hunter College and the CUNY Graduate Center. Her recent work has focused on comparing immigration in the U.S. today and in the past, and on how immigration has been remaking American society. She has written extensively on immigration to New York City, past and present, and is the author of more than 20 books, the most recent being 1/4 of the Nation, Immigration and the Transformation of America. And last but not least, we have Muzaffar Chishti, a lawyer and senior fellow of the Nonpartisan Migration Policy Institute and director of MPI's office at New York University School of Law. He has co-authored or authored a number of publications on U.S. immigration, admission policies, immigration enforcement, and rights of immigrants. He has testified extensively on immigration policy issues before Congress and serves on the boards of a number of immigration-focused organizations. So welcome to the 3 of you. I appreciate each of you taking your time and lending your expertise to such an important subject. Camille, starting with you. In his recent State of the City address, Mayor Eric Adams spoke about the 172,000 asylum seekers that the city has helped, including the 105,000 that have gone on the path to self-sufficiency. Yet the influx of asylum seekers is largely called a crisis. Can you please set the stage for us? What is the scope of the crisis for the city? What are the biggest challenges, particularly when it comes to setting migrants onto this path of self-sufficiency?
Sure, absolutely. And first of all, thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here and talking about this topic that certainly is one of the biggest issues facing the administration and that we are working on every day. And to your point, while it's a crisis, as we think about us as being part of sort of a global society, we do recognize that this is going to be ongoing, right? The migration waves that are happening in the United States right now, it is not the only migration that is happening. People are moving all over the world for all sorts of reasons. Focusing very specifically on New York City, it's been about 2 years since the first bus of asylum seekers came to New York City. I think it was March of 2022 when the first bus came. As you noted, we cared for over 172,400 people. We've submitted approximately 30,000 asylum seeker work authorization and TPS applications from a site that's pretty much was created from scratch, and have helped approximately 100,000 asylum seekers sort of move on to their next steps. But this has impacted all of our city services, right? It is an unexpected situation that we have been facing. I think we take an incredible amount of pride in the work that we have done, and we have had tons of individuals from both the federal government, other governments, nonprofits, as many places you could possibly think of, CBOs that have come in to take a look at the work that we have done, and for the most part have been incredibly supportive of the work that we have done, and we take a lot of pride in that. We have a shelter system that serves sort of traditional New Yorkers that took us decades to build. We had approximately 20 months to build the system for where we are right now, and it has doubled our capacity in the city. We've opened up over 212 emergency shelters in a very short period of time, in addition to humanitarian rescue and respite centers. And so while we internally are very focused on moving from a crisis state to a steady state, because we know that while there will be ebbs and flows, I think at a peak, we've received in excess of 4,000 individuals a week. We know we have to make those shifts, and so that's what we've been doing. And so helping the asylum seekers, as we frequently refer to them, our new New Yorkers, get on the path to self-sufficiency, that is our top priority. We think a lot of that is really rooted in their ability to work and provide for themselves. We've had the opportunity to speak with many of them, both here as well as down at the border, and they all sort of resoundingly say, we want the ability to work, to provide for ourselves, to provide for our families. So continuing to advocate for that and think creatively about how we can create those pathways or help them with those pathways is important. And also focusing on intensive case management, as well as our application help center, which has been really incredible to see all the work that has been done and our ability to file those 30,000 applications.
Thank you so much for that overview. Really appreciate it. Muz, turning to you, how would you describe this current migration crisis, and what would you like to see from the current asylum processing system?
Well, I think Camille laid it out well, the nature of the crisis that has faced New York City. But it's a global crisis, and particularly hit the United States hugely in the last 3 years. And those 3 years have coincided with the Biden administration. So unfortunately, the Biden administration has been confronted with a crisis that it was not prepared for. And we have challenge at the border, and the nature of the challenge has radically changed even in the last 5 or 6 years, to be very clear. We have today laws, regulations, resources, staffing for an era of border challenge, which is no longer true. Like even 5, 6 years ago, the border challenge was single Mexican men sort of clandestinely trying to enter the US looking for a job. Now, no element of that description today is valid. We have more and more families are coming, more and more non-Mexicans are coming, and they're not clandestinely coming in. They're coming to the border seeking asylum, which then creates a whole different challenge of the asylum system. So you could say we have a border crisis, but we also have an asylum crisis, because it is the promise of asylum that is drawing people to the country. And that has now reached unprecedented numbers. In our present asylum system, anyone who is admitted at the border is sent for a hearing before an immigration court system. That court system already has like close to 3 million cases in the backlog. So if these cases are sent to that backlog system, they won't even hear their first hearing probably for 6 to 7 years. And during that time, people get work authorized and people have no fear of being removed. So that has become a magnet in itself, which has two distinct problems. One is that it actually doesn't give people who truly deserve our asylum under our asylum law asylum quickly enough. And it helps people to clog the arteries of asylum who are not eligible for asylum. So what we need to do is have a reform of our asylum system where cases can be determined very efficiently and fairly. We at the Migration Policy Institute have argued that the elements of that is not to send new border cases to the courts, but send them to asylum officers within the US Immigration and Customs Service, Citizenship Service. Because these are asylum officers who are country experts. These cases can be determined in months as against years, and so that people actually have an outcome in a reasonable period of time. I think if we manage to get there, we will create a dent, which would then send a message in social medias, which, by the way, is now hugely important for the way people are drive to themselves to the border. That look, if you're going to come to the US, you're not guaranteed to live here with work authorization for years, and you're going to get an asylum hearing quickly. I think it's that unchecked sort of flows at the border, which then would stay here for years, which created the special challenge for New York City. And New York City, that we say, is unique in this world on providing universal right to shelter. That itself then became a magnet. So we're confronted with two magnets of a crisis, and that's what we are dealing with them simultaneously in our own city.
So, brief follow-up, do you see any willingness, or what is it that you're seeing on the federal level in terms of enacting asylum reforms along the lines of what you're saying?
So I think federal government, to be completely nonpartisan on this, I think took this challenge on a little too late, seriously. I mean, the president did not use the word crisis till last week. Last Friday is the first time he has used the word crisis. While we had to declare it a crisis many months ago, if not a couple of years ago, to be in a crisis mode. I mean, how can you be in a crisis mode if you don't acknowledge there is a crisis? It's as simple as that. I think now we are in the middle of a possible bipartisan breakthrough of a border security bill in the Senate, that both Republicans and Democrats realize that, look, we just can't accept the status quo. Something has to change. So we don't know, none of us have seen the text of the bill, but as you pointed out in introduction, we now have a border security bill, one of the most contentious domestic policy issues, tied with one of the most important foreign policy issues, which is aid to Ukraine. And you can see how hard that is. But the idea was, as large as in DC, if you want anything happen, make it bigger. So people try to make it bigger by tying these two things. And the idea would be to have a different standard of screening people at the border, so that fewer people meet the criteria to be admitted in to process their asylum claims. There also is a significant effort to increase detention beds, because only since we don't have enough detention beds, that people are let into the country. And there's a lot of emphasis in trying to reduce the authority of the president to grant parole. Parole is a peculiar element of our law under which the executive has the authority to let people in. And 1 million people have been let on parole under the Biden administration. Congress seems to be sort of skeptical about the use of group classification for paroles as against individual classification. They're troubled that all Cubans or all the Venezuelans should be. So there is some tendency to restrict group classification on parole.
Thank you for that clarification. Nancy, we at Network 2020, we're big on context, and I think historical context is a very good thing to bring into this conversation. So how does this current inflow compare to historical inflows, and what makes it different?
You're muted, Nancy. I'm sorry.
Oh, you're muted. Yes.
Right. Thank you, Camille. Yeah, we come back to New York City. New York City has, of course, always been an immigrant city. Currently, there's 36% of New Yorkers are foreign-born or immigrant, but that's actually lower than it was in 1910 when it was 41%. So actually, in my remarks, I want to just start by going back a little further to what I often call the last great wave of immigration between about 1880 and 1920, and look at some of the differences, okay? And that was a huge immigration to New York, virtually all Europeans and mainly Jews from Eastern Europe and Italians from Southern Italy. And if we go back, the legal context was just completely different, okay? There were no numerical limits on immigration at that time between 1880 and 1910. You didn't need a visa to come to the United States to live and work, and that didn't get instituted until the 1920s. Before World War II, there was no such thing, a legal thing such as asylum. And of course, there was no right to shelter law, but actually even in New York, not till 1981. So 100 years ago, hardly any immigrants in New York were undocumented. They were screened before they came. The big thing was getting on the boat in Europe. They were screened mainly for disease. And when they got to Ellis Island and landed at Ellis Island, only 2% of all those who came to Ellis Island were turned away. So there were very few, hardly any undocumented immigrants. And of course, there were no asylee seekers. That would have been something. But I want to come back and just say one more thing at this point about the numbers, because I know we're talking about these unprecedented numbers and, we've never seen anything like this before. But I think we do need to put this into context. And here I'm not just talking about 1880 to 1920. I'm talking about the post-1965 period and, the last few decades. New York City has received, has been in the midst of a very heavy wave of immigration for the last 40 years or so. And if we look back, say, to the 1990s, over 100,000 immigrants were coming into the city every year in the early 1990s. And we do have 3.1 million immigrants in New York. So I do think, when there are issues today, obviously, we've heard from both Camille and from Muz, but I think we do need to put this in perspective that the city does have a huge immigrant population. And people are coming to New York, by the way, not just as asylum seekers, but with green cards too. I mean, there are immigrants still arriving with green cards. New York still has an appeal to many immigrants. So I think we do need to, that's, just a different perspective a little bit, just to put this in the larger context of immigration.
And I think if I can just respond to that point, I think it's a great one, and thank you, Nancy, for the lesson, because I think it's important to ground this all. I do want to note that you are absolutely right in terms of the incredible diversity of New York City, and which I personally think is its strength, right? And certainly I'm very aware of the immigration, the global immigration that has happened in New York City throughout its entire history. I myself am an immigrant. I came here from Trinidad and Tobago as a child. And while I lived in Rochester, New York for a long time, I couldn't wait to get to New York City because I knew about its diversity. I knew and appreciated the unique characteristics of this city because it is built by immigrants and is largely populated by folks that came from different places. So I think what the distinction that I really want to focus on is, 4,000 folks a week and a governor that is very deliberately sending people here to make a larger point. I think that is a distinction that is worth noting.
Thank you for that. Camille, just sticking with you and broadening it out a little bit. I understand the city has done a lot of homework in trying to understand how other jurisdictions have grappled with inflows of asylum seekers and migrants. Can you just talk a little bit about what the city has learned from its due diligence, how New York is working with other global cities, and really how we need to engage with the international community to address this crisis?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, through our office of Mayor's Office of Immigrant International Affairs, we certainly have reached out to numerous cities, including Hamburg, Amsterdam, and Berlin, that have histories of successfully integrating large waves of refugees. A lot of them, I think, around 2015. And just to understand sort of best practices, what have they done, and to explore creative solutions for housing. And so a lot of the learnings that came from those conversations helped to shape some of the things that we considered as we designed our own system here as we've been going through this. We've also been talking to global migration experts, leaders of NGOs, nonprofits, both internationally, nationally, as well as locally. We've certainly looked at our own absorption of thousands of Ukrainian immigrants that have come here and can sort of compared it to the current population. I think one of the biggest distinctions being they had the ability to work, and that certainly made it much easier to integrate them, not just into New York City, but also to New York State. I think in addition to that, and I think as is known, the mayor is one that really wants to be on the ground. He's very much an on-the-ground mayor. And so I traveled with him to El Paso to see what was happening. We went to the border. We had lots of conversations with Customs and Border Patrol, right, to understand what they have been dealing with. And, I think one of the great things about him is that he calls out, it may not be fair to New York, but it's also not fair to the border towns that absorb the waves of folks that come in on a daily basis. Our team has also traveled to the U.S.-Mexico border, which I just referenced in 2022, not just with the mayor, but other members of the team went down there as well. And then he also went to Mexico City last year. He went to Mexico, he went to the Darien Gap in Colombia in October, had the opportunity to speak to individuals that were there, individuals that were getting ready to go into the Darien Gap, to really understand sort of the root causes of where we are, what they were fleeing, why they were coming to the United States, to understand what their perceptions were of what they would find when they arrived here. And I think the third component of it is just talking to our fellow big cities about what is happening and how it's impacting them. I think there's been recent news stories about Chicago and Denver in particular, as well as, of course, Massachusetts. And we're all sort of facing the same challenges, right? We want to have the biggest and widest open hearts and welcome as many folks as we can, but there are real constraints on what we can do, particularly when there isn't a national decompression strategy and when we don't always have the resources to care for folks in the way that we would want to.
Terrific. Thank you for letting us in on all that. Muz, turning a little, you talked a little bit about asylum before. I'd like to switch gears and talk about work. Work is obviously, it comes up several times. We've mentioned it over and over again. Eric Adams mentioned it in his State of the City. Governor Kathy Hochul has announced 18,000 jobs that could be filled by migrants with work permits. With this being such an elemental piece of this puzzle, even if the asylum process were to be solved, what are some of the structural challenges and opportunities that you see within the overall labor market?
Courtney, I'm too very delighted to tell you, but can I just take 1 minute to talk about politics? Because you just cannot escape the role of politics in this. First, I hope no one gets an impression from this that I or anyone else on this panel thinks that we should abandon our commitment to asylum or abandon our commitment to universal right to shelter. These are two defining value-driven elements of our policy, and they should be preserved. We are founded on the principle of asylum. We have to be leaders in the world to tell other countries that their commitment to asylum has to stay intact. Same is true for universal right to shelter. We should be proud of it. I mean, I think I've been educated in the fact that we don't have homelessness crisis in our city like San Francisco or LA or DC because of the right to shelter. So we really cannot abandon it. These are rights and sort of values that have to be strengthened. They don't have to be abandoned. So we have to mend them to make sure that we don't end them. And that's sort of what I think the reforms that we all have to be focused on. Governor Abbott made it a political stunt to send people to New York City. We did not have this kind of visible crisis in our city until it was driven by a political motive of a governor to make that. So we have to be aware of that. And even the congressional action that I talked about earlier, today, members of Congress are busy not supporting a bill that would address this crisis because they would rather have an issue going into the election as against an outcome. So all that politics is important. On your point, I like to say that we have two crises in immigration, and they're really intricately linked. One is we actually do have need for labor migration. We have a population crisis. We have no net growth of population native. We have demand for workers, especially at the lower end of a wage scale and middle end. And we don't have legal channels for letting people in. In fact, to be blunt, the only way, other than through family unification, if you want to come to the country for employment-based immigration, it's high-end computer occupations. There are no other. So that just doesn't make sense. So we have argued at the migration policy issue that we have to adopt a new bridge visa, which sort of bridges occupations from low skills to high skills and bridges temporary workers to permanent workers. We kind of make a mockery of saying that people are coming for temporary work. Well, we know they're coming for long-term absorption in the labor market, and our present law doesn't allow that. We think we should allow people on the basis of employer sponsorship to come for periods of 3 years, and then at the end of 3 years, they can extend it by 3 more years, but they could also have the option of returning back to their countries and coming from a different visa, 3-month, 3-year bridge visa later on, so that we can encourage even circular migration. We think that increasingly large number of people do not want to live in the US for the rest of their lives, but they want to work legally and be able to travel. The bridge visa would accomplish that. And the number for that should be determined by an independent commission, not by politicians, like we do with Federal Reserve does it for interest rates. We haven't changed our level of immigration for the last 35 years. We change interest rates every quarter. So that doesn't make sense even to a Trump supporter. So if we have a flexible system, which tells you what the need of the economy is, that becomes the number for the next 2 years. And if we introduce circularity, I think the combination of the two will meet the demand. And the reason Congress is not doing it is because of the border crisis, that they are at least able to point out that, look, whether they mean it or not, that till you fix the border, we can't move on legal immigration. That's why these are twin crises and they're linked.
Thank you for that helpful summary. Nancy, last question, and then I'll turn to the Q&A box. And we have a lot of good questions coming in. And if you're watching, listening, and would like to ask a question, please do put it into the Q&A box. Nancy, in this first part of the mini-series, when we looked at root causes of migration from the Northern Triangle, the importance of connections came up. Could you please talk about the role of networks in the current crisis? How are connections playing a role, and does this differ from what you've seen historically?
Well, let me just, yes, network connections. Let me deal with the similarities, because network connections have always been critical for migrants coming to the US or to New York City in finding housing and finding jobs. In fact, in coming here in the first place. Often immigrants come to New York precisely because they have relatives and friends and ethnic communities that are here. Relatives often send money home to enable them to come. So that's always, that's nothing new. And linking this up to the job market, immigrants often, and certainly new arrivals, often use network connections, particularly to relatives, also as often friends, to get jobs. Often because they don't speak English or don't speak English well, although that's today, many immigrants come with English, but many don't. and often because they lack information about or ties to the broader labor market. What's interesting and is often discussed in the literature is, well, we understand why immigrants want to use their ties to get jobs, but why do employers often prefer it? And we're talking about private employers. And because one, it's cheaper than advertising or going through agencies, but also because employers find it more reliable to ask if they have an opening or openings, to ask existing employees to recommend people for the job, because they feel that they're going to recommend somebody who's going to work out. Because if they recommend somebody who doesn't work out, the employer isn't going to go back to them again. And also because employees who sponsor relatives employees who sponsor relatives often provide informal training on the job. So those are things that have been true for a long time. But there are differences today. In earlier historical periods, and even before the migrant crisis, most new arrivals to New York City headed for ethnic enclaves or ethnic communities that had developed, because in fact, that's often why they picked New York in the first place to come to. But I should also add that in addition to having relatives and friends there who could put them up and to help them get jobs, also there are institutions in these communities that could help them too, particularly religious institutions, churches, temples, mosques. But today, many of the newest migrants seeking asylum are from countries like Venezuela, and I'm talking here about New York City, and another top country that I found out about just the other day, in Mauritania. There are no sizable ethnic communities in New York, at least not yet, for those groups. And so the recent asylum seekers also didn't pick New York. They were bused from Texas, right? They were bused here. So they often lack close relatives or close ethnic, people from their communities back home. And so they're more dependent on government help for housing and getting work. So I think and I think we also need to think that those who were bused here and who come to New York and who are often having difficulties, adjusting, getting jobs, housing, may end up leaving to go to other places. We know just because immigrants come to one place, even if they come there to settle. I mean, we just heard Camille say she went to Rochester and then came to New York City. But it could happen the other way around, although I don't know about Rochester in particular. But many of those who are bused here may end up, as migrants do, leaving and going somewhere else. I mean, migration, if we look from a demographic perspective, is a churning. People come here and they leave. And some go, I would certainly think many Venezuelans might want to go, for example, to Florida, where there are Venezuelan communities, or, I mean, we don't really know, but that's also a dynamic. And just before I end, because I just want to go back to a different issue, just to emphasize something that Muz said about the need for workers. I think we can see immigration, whatever types and varieties that will be true in the future. There is going to be a continued demand for immigration in this country because of the demographics, the aging of the baby boomers. The baby boomers by 2030 will all be over 65. They are a huge cohort, right? They're not going to be there are going to be job openings. And also we have falling fertility rates in this country. So between those two, there's going to be demand for workers at actually all levels, including, at the lower levels. And, as the population ages, there's going to be a demand for people to care for the elderly. I mean, that's another issue. So I think that we have to factor that in too, in terms of looking at immigration.
Thank you. 100%. It's almost like the insertion of politics seems like we're just shooting ourselves in the foot here. We have a lot of great questions in the Q&A box, and I'll actually use what we just mentioned about work as a jumping off point for you, Camille. So we have a question here that the questioner says, good to hear that the administration is looking for best practices in the country and around the world. Are there opportunities for more human-centered urban-rural cooperation? Can the city work more closely with rural communities in New York and across the country who are hurting for people or a workforce?
Thank you, Courtney. It's a great question. I did want to note just a couple of things based on Nancy's comments. First, I will say that while it was an unexpected detour, Rochester was a wonderful place to grow up. So I want to say that, and I also want to address the individuals who are bused here and whether or not they pick New York. I mean, they're given, not a great choice, right? Because what oftentimes happens in the conversations that we've had is that they're told you can go one of 4 places, right? And so they end up in this circumstance where they need to move on. They've come across, they don't have any other place to go, and so they end up picking the location. And I completely understand, for all sorts of reasons, why they would pick New York. But going further into what you've described, the largest population that is comprised of the asylum seekers that are here is the Venezuelan population. And you are exactly right. The largest community of Venezuelans is in Florida. So that, of course, has been challenging, but perhaps that's the largest population is now in New York as a result of this wave of immigration. With respect to the jobs issue that you've mentioned, this is a huge opportunity. Immigration, I think, in large part, is always a huge opportunity. We have plenty of jobs in New York City, as well as New York State, as well as across the country. And we've had conversations not only with New York State, with our own labor leaders here in the city and with other cities across the state, and those conversations across the country, and those conversations are ongoing. I think the challenge is folks are looking for individuals that have work authorization. That is really the key component. So I think the top lines that I want everyone to appreciate is that, yes, we recognize the opportunity and we are actively seeking to plug this population into those opportunities, which is a big part of the reason that our legal assistance clinic is so important, right? Getting them on that path. Our continued advocacy led to the expansion of TPS for more Venezuelans. And so all of those things are important so that we can help them get on that next path. And we are actively in conversations trying to create those opportunities, set up job training, et cetera, so that, when the work authorization comes through, they are poised and ready to be able to immediately plug into the market.
Perfect. Thank you. Muz, we have a question here. They write, part of the immigration challenge is the reason why people leave their home countries in the first place. What should the U.S. be doing to influence those countries' regions to address the conditions that lead to such immigrations?
Well, I'm sure you did your first part of your discussion on the push factor. I think these are really very difficult things to address. And, I think the Biden administration has attempted to do some. I mean, it is trying to provide aid in some countries in Central America, especially, so to address issues of poverty, but more issues of governance. I mean, a lot of people will tell you that just the lack of stability and security in these societies, just the extent of corruption in the governance mechanisms. So building confidence through governance mechanism, I think, would do a lot. I think, as you pointed out very rightly in your own introduction, COVID played a huge role. I mean, people have seen COVID as a health issue. People haven't appreciated the impact of COVID as an economic issue. I mean, Venezuela, the example that we all talk about, 6 to 7 million Venezuelans had left Venezuela, had been resettled in about 16 Central and South American countries. Applause to those countries. But as a result of COVID, the economic conditions, it became hard for people to sustain their lives in those countries, and we started seeking the secondary migration. So actually help in those countries, many of them depend on tourism for their economies, I think would go a long way. But these are long-term solutions. We shouldn't expect that they will have an impact tomorrow for this surge to change. So therefore, we have to think very hard at our own domestic responses to this. I'm one of those people who think that pull factors are almost always more important than push factors. And we have a little more control over pull factors, and that's what we should be focusing on.
And this could be an interesting follow-up to the question about the pull factor, and goes into your earlier comments about right to shelter. And so actually I'll turn to you first, Nancy, but I welcome everyone's comments on it. So the questioner asks about the 30-60 day rule that in the questioner's opinion is designed to wear down migrants mentally, emotionally, and physically to get them out of New York. However, curious one to hear Camille's response to that, but also Nancy, if you could just start us off and again, try to put policies in context for us so that we can understand what's happening.
Well, I think probably Camille is better at doing this on this issue, particularly because she's dealing with it, every day. But clearly, I mean, the city is trying to cope with having to house all these people that it doesn't have the ability to do. So, I mean, I think that's what they're doing. I mean, I don't know how, it may seem inhumane, but what is the alternative? Because people are coming in all the time. So the numbers, I think I'm going to defer to Camille on this because I think she clearly knows much more about it than I do and why the city is doing this and how it's dealing with it.
Sure, thank you. I mean, what it comes down to, we have very limited tools to manage the influx and to manage the entire system that we have. And so the rules are really designed to drive a focus on what do I need to do to move on to the next step. But it's not being done without additional supports, right? So we've got a robust case management program that we are constantly looking at, refining, and scaling up. There are conversations that are had with adults and families with children to really understand sort of what is their plan, right? And if you get to for families with children who are subjected to the 60-day notice, they have a series of conversations. It's not as though we just sort of show up on the 60th day and say, hey, by the way, you've got to be gone tomorrow. We have conversations about them. What have you done already? What have you looked at? Who do you know in the country? Where would you like to go? In many of those conversations, we have found asylum seekers that didn't know that they could still be reticketed. And so we've had many asylum seekers who have gotten to that limit. I think for the adults who are subject to the 30-day limit, about 80% of them don't come back, right? They don't come back and ask for additional shelter. The families with children, that is a newer limit. And so we'll see what happens. But if the families with children need an extension, we make sure that we factor that in. We also really want to make sure that to the extent that they have school-aged children, that we are doing what we can to ensure that they are able to continue going to school. But fundamentally, what we need are the resources to be able to care for everyone that's here, right? We want to do as much as we can, but unfortunately, our resources are finite.
Thank you. Muz, any comments on that regarding the pull factor?
Yeah, I mean, I think with all credit, I think the administration has done quite well in a really difficult situation. I mean, the secret sauce of immigration, which Nancy will bear me out why it has worked magically for New York and the whole country in the past, as immigrants are seen as net contributors. It's a net benefit. And people come and they contribute in their jobs, and they contribute to their tax base, and they get no benefits almost. Certainly the people who don't have a green card are eligible. In this case, just because of the way the targeted approach by the governor of Texas began it became a sudden, dramatic onslaught on New York City to its fiscal system. So it became almost all off cost and no benefit from the immigrants right in the beginning. So the New York City, I think, administration had to deal with a very, very sudden, unexpected crisis when we were already in a difficult financial situation coming out of COVID. And I think it has done the best compromise. That's why I think the 30 and the 60-day rules are not, they're not unreasonable. That you really allow people to find their place through their networks after a certain reprieve they get from the city. And we hope that they will be able to do the same as prior waves of immigrants have done. So this may be the best sort of short-term response that the city could afford. But let me say the final point on this is that why federal government, I think, did not grab this quickly, is that we should have quickly realized this was a national phenomenon. This was not an Abbott versus Adams phenomenon, border versus inner city, rural versus, that the president should have said, look, whatever it is, this is a national crisis now. And we're going to have sort of burden sharing at the national level. That we, federal government, since the federal government is deciding to let people in, federal government then has to have some responsibility on coming up with paying the costs for resettling or receiving those people. It didn't do that. It didn't make it a federal. So it sort of became New York City had to fend for itself and then seek reimbursement. The federal government didn't have the right resources. So it needs that kind of national coordinated response to reimburse impacted states and cities. But for do that at the real level that it needs, you need huge supplemental appropriation by Congress. And that hasn't happened. But to my very first point, we should have accepted that there was a crisis and acknowledged this is a crisis and gone to Congress, both Republicans and Democrats together, and say this is a national crisis for which we need a national response, even reimbursement. And I think we didn't do that at the right time.
Oh, yes, Nancy.
Maybe I just want to add one thing to what Moose had said about pull factors and push factors. I mean, obviously we could, debates as to which are more important. But I think clearly we're talking long term, but what's interesting is actually the Mexican case, because the Mexican case, due to improvements in the economy in Mexico, and also demographic factors in terms of fewer people being born and needing to, wanting to go abroad. I mean, the rates from Mexico went down for a while. I mean, I think they're moving up again, but the rates did decrease. So, and that didn't have anything to do, well, I don't know how much that had to do with the United States, but I mean, I don't think we need to think, at least from all these countries, that it's just gonna be this perpetual, mass move. So I think, we can think that there may be changes in the economy, changes in the demography that may reduce some of the pressure to move from some of the countries. But I agree with Moose. I mean, that this is often long term, and I'm not sure. And foreign, I don't know how much. And some of these are not due to the United States. I mean, policy. But just to think about that in general, so we don't sort of think it's just this inevitable. We haven't even talked, by the way, about where these are people. Most of the people coming, right, or the biggest group are from Venezuela. But we're also talking about African migration, right, and the impact of climate change. And one of the things that's occurring that's been written about is that people are coming from Africa to cross the, I mean, so we've got new flows coming that way. So we can't just assume it's all going to be from Central America, So that's another issue to add to the.
Great point. We're getting a few questions in the Q&A about the makeup of people and protections. And so I'm going to put this in a two-part. So I'll first go to Camille and then to you, Nancy. And so I'd love just to hear your response, Camille, to what the city is doing, particularly for women and children, and whether or not people are susceptible to the black market. Someone's mentioning the migrant children selling candy on the subway during school hours. So curious to hear the administration's response to that. And Nancy, if you wouldn't mind talking after a little bit about how when more women are coming in, when in the past it was mostly single men, this questioner asks, what are some of the unique challenges they face and what can the government do to support them, and sort of contextualizing that for us, please. Camille.
Sure. I think certainly from my part, we are incredibly focused on women and children, and particularly concerned. And that not only comes from the traditional vulnerability, but also, and going back to my earlier statements about what the mayor certainly learned, what we all learned, and about what happens when you go through the Darien Gap. There's an incredible amount of trauma in this population because of what they've gone through, because of what they're dealing with. The rates of sexual assault that happen in the Darien Gap are incredibly high. And so there's several things that we are sort of focused on. So one, in terms of kids, really connecting them to school, which helps to build community as quickly as possible. And I am incredibly grateful to New York City Public Schools. And I've had the opportunity to speak to lots of New Yorkers who were also very concerned about the 60-day limits. Because they had created such an amazing community for the children, for the asylum seeker children that they had absorbed, and they really want them to stay, right? They want to continue those efforts. We have absorbed, I think, in excess of 30,000 students into New York City public schools. It's really unbelievable, and there are so many parents and professionals that have stepped up to take care of them. So there's certainly that. We have at our legal assistance clinic, as well as in many of our facilities, staff to help to deal with the trauma. So social workers, psychologists, if we have them on staff, to be there. You know, the average application at the legal assistance clinic takes about 4 hours. And it's not just because of the complexity of the story. A lot of times it's because both the applicant and the person filling out the application on their behalf are incredibly overwhelmed by the stories and what they're hearing. And it just becomes challenging to move through that work. So we are very focused on it. We want to make sure that we continue to provide the additional supports for the population. That's why, as an example, families with children have a 60-day limit, not a 30-day limit. More robust case management to make sure that we are focused on that as well. And I think we will continue to focus on the issues that are particular to the women and children and families that are in our care.
Hi. Oh,
Okay.
Courtney, are you there?
Yes, I'm here, and I would love to hear your thoughts on the larger issue of
Well, you
women.
know, actually, in terms of the whole migration to New York or to the US, and women are a very high percentage, and from some countries, more women are coming than men. I mean, so it's not like we don't have many. I don't know the ratio among these asylum seekers coming to New York City, but if you look at the figures on many groups, there are more women than men here, from immigrants. For women, I mean, obviously the issue of sexual harassment or rape on the journey, but also the degree to which women are being separated from their children, because typically often they don't bring their children with them because they may, I mean, in the past, I don't know what's going on now, but there is a large literature, I should say, in the social sciences on migrant women coming, often leaving their children behind. Because it's dangerous often to bring them across the border. And then there are these long separations that they have with their children, which interestingly are much harder for women. Well, maybe not interestingly, maybe you would expect this, are much harder for women being separated from their children than the men. And interestingly, there was a study of Mexican undocumented immigrants, and the men felt that they were fulfilling their job and duties as husbands and fathers by earning money and sending it back. But the women who came and were separated from their children felt that they were not being good mothers. And the children, in fact, often emphasized that in their conversations with their mothers. And so I think this is very difficult for many women and for many children. The process of reunification with parents after being separated for many years is also difficult. And this has happened before. I assume it's going to be part of the process today also with those who are coming. I think if we look at something optimistic, but to end on a somewhat optimistic note about both families, I mean, one of the conclusions from a lot of migration research is that the children of immigrants, and here we're looking at the children of immigrants who come here and are educated here, are doing better than their parents, overwhelmingly. That it's a happy story in a way. And we should also emphasize that their parents, whether they're coming, asylees, or they're taking an enormous. I always think of them actually as being sort of heroes in many ways, right? Immigrants are ambitious. They're willing to leave their countries, right, and come somewhere else in really difficult circumstances to provide a better life for their families and their children. And they want their children to do well. And many of them do well. I mean, I think and New York City, to plug New York City, is a welcoming place in that respect, not just in terms of its elementary school to high school, but I have to put in a plug here for the institution with which I teach, which is the City University of New York, which has 250,000 students, unlike any city in the country. It's overwhelmingly immigrants and children of immigrants who are the students there. And this is a gateway to mobility. They can live at home. They don't have to, tuition is fairly low. They can work while they're in school. So I guess from a point of looking from a mother's point of view, but also from a father's point of view, in this sense, coming to New York, is a step. We can look to the future, I guess. I'm saying, these people are coming. They need to get jobs, obviously. They need to get housing. New York is a very expensive city in which to get housing. But, you know, if once they settle, which many of them are going to do, right? Although many of them are going to be undocumented, and that's you know, that's another issue, right? Because they're not going to get legalized. They're not. There's a very few, well, a very small percentage of those who seek asylum actually get asylum. Okay, and the question is, will they go back or will they stay in an undocumented state? So I mean, that's another issue, right, to raise. But you know,
it's a great point that this is, you know, maybe it's a crisis in the short term, but if you broaden that lens and you look generationally, you know, it really is.
And Courtney, if I might, just on the
Mm.
optimistic note that Nancy mentioned, which I think is a great thing to lean into. You know, in addition to the things that I talked about before, I do want to be clear. Education, we are fully aware, not just because of this particular moment that we are in, but also because we have undocumented folks in New York City and certainly in our shelter system, labor exploitation, sexual trafficking, all of those things are things that we know that this population is primed to get pulled into. To Nancy's point, the vast majority of folks that are in our care are families with children. So it's a very high population of women. And so we also make sure that we do lots of education around those issues. We try to come up with additional activities. Shout out to the Girl Scouts who have something here. I'm not sure if many people would be aware, but they have something called Troop 6000, which is this incredible group of Girl Scouts that are only in homeless shelters. And they are incredible young people that we get to have conversations with, and they get to participate in all of those activities. So those things are there, but we are fully aware of all of the concerns. I think that's one of the reasons that we call on the federal government to sort of finish the job. You have a lot of people that come here and they're not here illegally. Many of them have gone through a process. They have been paroled into the US. And then because they don't have work authorization, they end up plugging into the illegal job market. And so we're aware of that, and we just want to make sure they have the right at least to work.
Great. Before I get to, I'll do one final question for a group question for each of you. But before I do that, we did have a question in the chat that I wanted to broaden out. Camille, are there ways for people in New York to volunteer and get involved?
Yeah, absolutely. So there is a website for the Office of Asylum Seeker Operations, and there are opportunities there to either send an email if you have a specific request, or to learn how you can help out even more. And then, of course, there's New York City Service, which is the arm of New York City government that focuses on both creating opportunities for us to volunteer outwardly, but also to come in. And so I think the website has been dropped in the chat for anyone who is interested.
Thank you. Final question, sort of our lightning round. I'll go around each of you, Muz, Nancy, Camille. If you could see one thing happen in this next year, what would you most want to see to help alleviate the current crisis, or I guess I shouldn't use crisis, but almost chronic condition?
Well, I hope that Congress finally sees this as a national challenge and as not a political opportunity for grandstanding. It really, I think we have suffered from politicization of this issue, that we are a country that still is wedded to the idea of asylum, wedded to the idea that immigrants really contribute, but it has to be done in an orderly, managed way, that we keep asylum open for people who deserve it, and it doesn't become an incentive for people to try to get here who don't. And I think we can do that by reforming our asylum system. If you ask me what's one thing I would do, you put my, back to the wall, I would say hire 5,000 asylum officers. They will make much more dent in this than anything else than we can do. So simple things like that can make a lot of difference.
Thank you. Nancy?
Oh my gosh. Well, I agree, of course, with everything that Moose says, right? But I think also, Congress hasn't passed an immigration law, right? Has not amended it, right? We're dealing with it since 1990. Among other things, we need to allow more immigrants in legally, more green cards. And I think that's, the number, that would be one step towards relieving some of the pressure to come. And I guess I don't know how we do this, but not have governors in the southern states, right? Like sending immigrants to New York And also, I think, finally, just mention that I think this notion of a positive view of immigration, both through in the country and also the city. I do have to say I was disturbed when the mayor talked about, migrant crisis, possibly destroying, New York. And I think, the political leaders should be also talking and a pro-immigrant, not pro-immigrant, but emphasizing the contributions and immigrants. And it's certainly looking at New York, that they've always built New York and have been important to the city. So I would hope for that.
Yeah, I think I would add, in addition to echoing everything that everyone said, because all of those points are incredibly valid. I do think that words matter. And so I think the language that we use around these issues are important. And so again, I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak to this audience about how we feel. I think I want folks to know that this is an administration that is full of either immigrants or descendants of immigrants, pretty recent. And so we take this work, it is incredibly personal to us. I think that comprehensive immigration reform is likely a bipartisan issue. And if everyone can just sort of take a step back, look at this globally, recognize, as I think Muz said, that immigration is a net positive, right? And so if we're thoughtful and careful about it, I think that there is a path forward. But as I look forward to the rest of the year, in addition to, of course, hoping that there is some sort of enactment of a tool or levers that we can exercise to help control the flow, certainly we would love a national resettlement strategy or decompression strategy, right? So whether it's folks coming in from the border, or as we are engaged right now in conversations with cities where they say, we've got jobs and we would love to be helpful, and let's create pathways to move folks across the country to places where there's tons of opportunity. We want to be able to do that. But I think the biggest thing that I hope is that we're able to find ways to get more asylum seekers on the path to the ability to legally work, because I think that this is a country that is full of incredible opportunity. We want them to be able to participate in that opportunity. It enriches us all as a society. And so I think that's the thing that would be most impactful on sort of a faster pace.
Thank you. Thank you to each of you for lending your expertise. Thank you to the audience for engaging, and the speakers for engaging, I think, in a topic that we need to have more solid conversations around. And so I really appreciate the opportunity to sit here with you today. Just a few housekeeping notes, and then we'll let everyone go. We have our next briefing is next week. We're with Ambassador Charles Ray. This is a virtual member-only briefing. We're looking at South Africa's democracy and foreign policy outlook and what it's doing within the BRICS. So that's Thursday night. And then we have on the 13th, we're looking at the Arctic, so global competition in the Arctic. So please do feel free to RSVP. We are a nonprofit. We're trying to keep these briefings free and open to all. So if you can, please support us. We would greatly appreciate it. And for those of you in New York, save the date of April 29th, because that's our gala, and there'll be more information sent. So thank you, Camille, Muz, Nancy. It was an honor. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Yeah,
everyone.
Thank you.